Imagine a spacecraft deep in transit, just sitting there for days in the absolute quiet of the void.
Right, totally isolated.
Yeah, exactly. The environment inside is meticulously controlled. It's dark, it's warm, it is entirely cut off from the chaos of the outside world. And, that is pretty much the exact reality of an embryo inside an IVF laboratory incubator.
It really is. For up to a week, it's just locked in this state of um, continuous, undisturbed cultivation.
But then the clock runs down, transfer day arrives, and that long-term quiet isolation gets replaced by this really rapid, highly dynamic, and incredibly high-stakes physical choreography.
Because you are looking at the ultimate biological transition here.
Yeah.
I mean, we are taking an organism from an environment where progress is measured in days of slow cellular division, right?
Yeah.
And moving it into a clinical environment where success is measured in fractions of a millimeter.
And split seconds.
Exactly. The incubator is a static safe haven, but the clinical procedure room next door, it is anything but static.
Well, welcome to today's deep dive. Today, you are stepping directly into the lab for those final, critical minutes.
We're mapping out the precise, step-by-step transit of preparing an embryo for transfer.
Yeah, we're going to look at the microscopic fluid mechanics required to move living cells, the strict chain of custody for human identity, and the surprising reason why this entire process relies on direct hand-to-hand delivery instead of modern automation.
It's a fascinating window of time. Years of reproductive endocrinology, months of patient prep, and days of delicate lab science all just converge into a single physical movement.
Because the margin for error is effectively zero, right?
Zero. Every single variable has to be controlled before the embryo even leaves the dish.
Which means before any physical movement actually happens, the environment itself has to be perfectly primed.
Right. You can't just pull it out of the incubator and leave it sitting on a heated bench while the clinical team preps the patient.
No, absolutely not. The lab goes into the state of high alert standby. They are just waiting for the exact moment the clinical environment, the weather in the procedure room, so to speak, is perfectly clear.
Because timing and temperature are the governing laws here. Mammalian embryos and even earlier stage cells are just extraordinarily sensitive to thermal shifts.
Like an unfertilized M1 or M2 oocyte, right?
Yeah, perfect example. An M1 or M2 oocyte is incredibly fragile. If the temperature drops even slightly, you risk altering the cell's internal scaffolding.
The meiotic spindle.
Yes, the meiotic spindle, which is the structure that ensures chromosomes divide correctly, it can literally depolymerize, just break down, if exposed to room temperature for too long.
Wow. So the embryologist just keeps the embryo locked in the incubator, maintaining that optimal temperature and pH until the absolute last second.
Right, they wait until the fertility specialist gives a definitive verbal signal that the patient's cervix is positioned and the anatomical pathway is completely clear.
And during that holding pattern, we actually hit the administrative peak of the entire IVF process.
The chain of identity.
Yeah, exactly. You have the biological material ready, but you have to ensure absolute certainty regarding whose it is. And relying purely on technology here, like scanning a barcode or reading an RFID tag on a dish, feels like it leaves a dangerous gap.
It does. Technology can misread or a scanner can glitch. And that vulnerability is exactly why the laboratory layers electronic tracking with a really rigorous manual system.
The strict three-way verbal match.
Right. The embryologist handling the dish, the clinical nurse acting as the witness, and the patient lying on the table. They all have to verify the information simultaneously.
Out loud.
Out loud. They read the patient's full legal name, their date of birth, and those unique medical record numbers verbally into the room.
Which forces this moment of absolute human presence. By making everyone speak the identifiers, you strip away that passive reliance on a computer screen.
It demands that three separate human beings actively take responsibility for the alignment of those numbers before any physical sequence can start.
And that verbal confirmation initiates what the laboratory calls the sterile cockpit rule, right?
It's borrowed directly from commercial aviation. You know how when a flight descends below 10,000 feet, regulations prohibit any casual conversation among the flight crew?
Because the cognitive load of landing requires singular focus.
Exactly. The IVF lab adopts that identical philosophy during embryo loading. The moment that three-way match is confirmed, the atmosphere in the lab physically shifts.
All the background chatter ceases.
Radios are turned off. The team operates in absolute unwavering silence.
So the room falls dead silent, the identity is locked, the clinical signal is given, Finally, the embryologist moves the dish from the incubator to the microscope.
And this is where we cross the boundary from pure biology into microscopic engineering.
Because you have to get a microscopic sphere of cells out of a static dish and into a human uterus, which means introducing a transport vehicle.
Right, the transfer catheter. And this is highly specialized. It's far more complex than just a standard medical syringe.
It's a dual lumen system, isn't it?
Yeah, 2 layers. The outer layer is a rigid guide sheath. The specialist uses that outer tube to navigate the anatomical curves of the cervix, which, can often be unpredictable or tight.
But the actual embryo never touches that rigid plastic.
Never. It sits inside an inner microcatheter, which has to be engineered to prevent the embryo from sticking to it.
Because biological cells are inherently sticky. They have surface proteins that naturally want to adhere to things.
And if an embryo catches on the plastic wall of the tube during the injection, the entire cycle fails.
So how do they stop that?
Well, to combat cellular adhesion, the inner microcatheter is extruded from highly specialized, non-toxic polymers. We're talking treated polyurethanes or Teflon-like materials.
Engineered at the molecular level, right?
Exactly. They use hydrophilic coatings. So when culture media touches the inside of this tube, it creates a microscopic boundary layer of water molecules.
Oh, wow. So the embryo just glides over this water layer. It never actually makes physical contact with the polymer wall itself.
That's the goal.
Mm-hmm.
But the embryologist doesn't just pull back a plunger and suck the embryo up into the tube.
Right. To ensure that gliding motion and to really protect the cell during transit, they execute a highly specific loading formula under the microscope.
They build a microenvironment inside the catheter using a very intentional sequence of fluids and air.
The fluid sandwich.
The fluid sandwich, yes.
Yeah.
The embryologist watches through the microscope and uses a microsyringe. First, they draw up a small volume of blank culture media. That's the trailing fluid.
Okay.
Next, they draw up a tiny, carefully measured air bubble.
Right.
Then, they move the tip of the catheter over the embryo and draw up the fluid droplet containing the actual cell,
Got it.
followed by a second microscopic air bubble. And finally, they draw up a bit more leading culture media.
So it's fluid, air, embryo, air, fluid.
Exactly.
But wait, I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because that presents a fascinating contradiction for you listening. In almost any other branch of medicine, intentionally introducing an air bubble into a human body is a severe protocol violation.
Oh, absolutely. An air bubble in an IV line is a massive hazard.
Right. Yet here, in the most delicate procedure imaginable, the lab is intentionally injecting 2 distinct air bubbles into the catheter. Why are we doing that?
I know, it seems totally counterintuitive. But it makes sense when you look at the biophysics of what is happening inside that tiny tube. Those air bubbles serve 2 critical functions.
Okay, what's the first?
Mechanically, they act as microscopic physical bumpers. When fluid moves through a narrow tube, it creates shear stress. The velocity of the fluid at the center of the tube is faster than the fluid dragging along the walls.
Ah, so by sandwiching the embryo's droplet between 2 pockets of compressible air, the lab dampens that shear stress?
Precisely. The air absorbs the shock of the fluid dynamics. It keeps the embryo suspended and structurally intact.
The air acts as a biological shock absorber. That is brilliant.
It really is. But there is a secondary clinical reason for the air, and it ties back to how the specialist actually navigates the procedure in the room.
Because you can't actually see a microscopic embryo on a standard clinical ultrasound machine.
No, the resolution simply isn't high enough.
But ultrasound waves interact very predictably with different densities.
Right. When acoustic waves travel through human tissue or liquid culture media, they pass through relatively easily. They appear dark or gray on the monitor.
However, when those sound waves hit a pocket of air,
The severe difference in density causes acoustic impedance. The sound waves bounce violently back to the probe.
meaning those 2 microscopic air bubbles light up bright, glowing white on the ultrasound monitor.
Yes, they become a brilliant tracking beacon. The specialist watches the ultrasound screen as they advance the inner catheter. They can't see the embryo, but they can watch those 2 bright white flashes move smoothly into the uterine cavity.
And because the lab built the fluid sandwich perfectly, the specialist knows with absolute certainty that the invisible embryo is resting safely right between those 2 markers.
Yeah, exactly. But doing that requires incredible discipline regarding fluid volume.
Because the uterus is a potential space, right? Meaning the muscular walls are naturally collapsed and touching each other.
Right, so introducing any fluid is going to force those walls apart. And fluid under pressure will always seek the path of least resistance.
Which brings us to the danger of the hydraulic effect.
Yeah, this is crucial. The total volume of that fluid sandwich must be kept agonizingly small. usually between 10 and 20 microliters.
That is a fraction of a single raindrop.
It's tiny. If the embryologist loads too much leading or trailing media, pressing the plunger introduces a large volume of liquid into that tight, closed space.
And the fluid hits the back wall of the uterus and has nowhere to go but backward. It creates a mechanical washout like a tidal wave that could easily sweep the embryo right back out through the cervix.
Completely undoing the entire procedure. So the precision of that microscopic volume is what prevents the hydraulic effect. The embryo must be deposited gently, allowing capillary action to naturally hold the tiny droplet in place against the uterine lining.
Okay, so the architecture is complete. The shock-absorbing air bubbles are positioned. The fluid volume is tightly restricted. The embryo is suspended in the inner catheter, and the sterile cockpit remains totally silent.
Right. Everything is ready.
Now we face the logistical challenge of moving this delicate, highly sensitive package across the boundary from the isolated lab into the bustling clinical procedure room.
This is where things get interesting logistically.
Yeah, because many modern sterile environments, like pharmaceutical compounding labs or biological containment facilities, they rely heavily on automated pass-through windows or mechanical drop boxes to transfer materials.
To preserve the clean room environment.
Right, so why not use a pass-through window here?
Well, from an engineering standpoint, a pass-through window makes perfect sense. But in the context of clinical embryology, those windows introduce unacceptable biological and psychological risks.
How so?
A pass-through hatch is essentially a tiny airlock. When you open the door on the lab side and the clinical team opens the door on their side, you inevitably pull a vacuum.
Oh, you introduce ambient, unconditioned air drafts from the clinic directly into the pathway of the catheter.
Exactly. And considering we established earlier that even a slight drop in temperature can depolymerize the meiotic spindle and damage the cell.
Exposing the tip of the microcatheter to a sudden draft of room temperature air is a massive biological hazard.
Huge hazard. Furthermore, those automated windows are often built of stainless steel or heavy acrylic. Those materials have significant thermal mass, which can actively draw heat away from the catheter.
So the physics just don't support it. But you mentioned a psychological danger, too.
Yeah, beyond the physics, there is a profound psychological danger. It turns a critical human procedure into an automated, passive transaction. Putting the catheter into a metal box, closing the door, and walking away, it breaks the chain of active accountability.
You lose the physical connection to the payload.
You do, which is why the standard protocol is entirely hand-to-hand. The embryologist acts as the physical carrier. They stand up from the microscope, holding the loaded catheter strictly upright so gravity doesn't shift the fluid sandwich.
Maintaining intense thermal awareness, shielding the catheter from any drafts.
And they physically walk out of the laboratory doors directly into the procedure room. They walk right up to the specialist at the edge of the surgical field.
It isn't a sample passing through a wall. It is a literal handoff. The embryologist's fingers physically pass the rigid outer sheath into the specialist's fingers.
And during that specific physical handoff, the loop of identity is closed one final time. Face to face, the embryologist and the specialist verbally confirm the patient's name aloud.
That detail is really worth lingering on. We are looking at a field defined by multi-million-dollar trigas incubators, advanced hydrophilic polymers, and complex acoustic ultrasound physics.
Oh, totally.
Yet the absolute safety of the entire endeavor does not rely on automated airlocks or electronic algorithms. It relies on direct, unbreakable human communication and hand-to-hand accountability.
It really grounds the immense technological weight of the process in a very fundamental human reality. The technology only facilitates the transfer. The responsibility remains entirely human.
Okay, so once the specialist has the catheter, the clinical phase takes over. They navigate the cervix. They watch the ultrasound screen for the acoustic flare of those air bubbles.
Right.
They press the plunger gently to avoid the hydraulic effect, depositing the fluid sandwich, and then slowly withdraw the catheter.
But the procedure still isn't over.
Because you can't see the cell on the ultrasound, only the air markers, which means the laboratory still has to mathematically prove the payload actually left the microcatheter.
Yes, the clinical action is finished, but the verification loop remains open. While the patient remains in position, the specialist hands the used catheter directly back to the embryologist,
who immediately turns, walks back into the laboratory, and sits down at the microscope for what's known as the flashlight check.
Right. They have to look inside the microscopic tube to ensure it is completely empty.
But they can't just look through the curved plastic of a catheter under a microscope, can they? That would distort the light.
Exactly. You couldn't trust what you were seeing. So they have to physically flush whatever is left inside the tube out into a clean dish.
And that flush requires force, right? Because the inner lumen of the catheter is so narrow, fluid mechanics dictate that it has high resistance.
It does. The embryologist attaches a syringe of fresh, highly viscous culture media and forcefully flushes the interior of the microcatheter out into a pristine petri dish,
Then they carefully scan the fluid in that dish under the microscope.
systematically searching the grid to confirm there's absolutely nothing there. And only when the embryologist raises their head and verbally declares clear is the transfer officially logged as complete.
Which naturally brings up the anxiety-inducing scenario. I have to ask on behalf of you listening, what happens if the embryologist flushes the microcatheter, scans the dish, and sees the embryo sitting right there in the fluid?
The retained embryo.
The payload didn't deliver. Does that mean panic?
Finding a retained embryo is a known statistical possibility, and it is really vital to demystify it here. A retained embryo is a harmless technical hitch. It is not a clinical failure, and it does not mean the embryo is damaged.
But it is hard to imagine it isn't damaged. I mean, it just traveled into the uterus, went through the pressure of the plunger, and was pulled all the way back out.
It survives precisely because of the fluid sandwich we discussed earlier. The embryo never touched the harsh environment of the cervix or the dry plastic of the catheter walls.
Ah.
It remained safely insulated inside its microscopic cushion of culture media. It was completely shielded from sheer stress and contamination.
So when the embryologist spots it in the flush dish, the sterile cockpit protocol absorbs the situation calmly.
Exactly. There is no panic because the microenvironment never degraded. The embryologist simply draws up a fresh microcatheter, meticulously rebuilds the embryo air fluid sandwich, walks it right back out into the procedure room, and hands it back to the specialist for a second immediate attempt.
But what about the biological toll of the delay? Does sitting in that transitional state, being loaded and reloaded, lower the statistical probability of the embryo implanting?
That's the common fear, but the clinical data on retained embryos is remarkably definitive. Extensive large-scale studies have tracked the outcomes of immediate retransfers, and they consistently show zero negative impact on implantation success or ongoing pregnancy rates.
Zero impact. Wow.
The embryo is entirely agnostic to the detour. As long as the thermal and pH parameters were maintained by the fluid cushion, the biological potential remains unchanged.
So following the second transfer, the embryologist simply repeats the flush protocol, scans the dish, and formally logs the clear status.
That's it. Loop closed.
Looking back at the sheer density of this sequence, the precision is staggering. We started with the absolute thermal isolation of the incubator. We moved into the profound silence of the sterile cockpit, driven by the three-way verbal identity match.
We broke down the biophysics of hydrophilic polymers and the fluid mechanics required to build a microscopic sandwich.
Acting as both a biological shock absorber and an acoustic tracking beacon, we explored the mechanical dangers of the hydraulic effect, the rejection of automated airlocks in favor of hand-to-hand accountability, and the final proof of the flashlight check.
And, when you look at the entirety of that physical transit, it represents a profound shift in responsibility. For the entire week prior, the embryologists were the sole caretakers of that microscopic life. They managed its chemistry, its temperature, its growth.
Yeah.
But the moment the embryologist's fingers release the rigid outer sheath of that catheter into the specialist's hands, the active laboratory cultivation phase ends. The lab is stepping back. Walking that catheter across the room is the literal physical act of handing hope back over to the patient.
It is the ultimate culmination of the science. We spend so much time in these deep dives analyzing the mechanics, the molecular coatings of the plastics, the acoustic impedance of the ultrasound, the viscosity of the culture media. But I want to leave you with a final thought to consider. Despite the overwhelming presence of that cutting-edge technology, the final, most consequential millimeter of this journey, the actual transfer of life, cannot be trusted to a machine. It still relies entirely on the steady, careful hands of one human being, passing it directly to another.
Which demonstrates that at its core, clinical embryology is still fundamentally anchored by the human touch.
It truly is. Well, we want to thank you for joining us in the lab for this incredibly detailed deep dive today, but our exploration of the laboratory's capabilities does not end here.
Not at all.
While one embryo makes that critical transit into the procedure room, the lab must manage the high-quality embryos that remain in the incubator. In our next deep dive, episode 14, Frozen in Time Vitrification and Cryostorage, we are taking the temperature in the exact opposite direction.
Oh, it's going to be a good one.
We will explore the mind-bending physics of flash-freezing surplus living cells at negative 196 degrees Celsius, arresting biological time indefinitely without forming a single lethal crystal of ice. It is a masterclass in extreme biophysics, and we look forward to unpacking it with you. See you next time inside the lab.